Good. Well, let's get into it. Today's weird because it's the 5 year anniversary of this pandemic, officially when the world was starting to close down. And I know that we're all trying to forget it, but it was so seismic. So I want to know how much of living through that time period has reverberated into your work and the way you live life now.
Oh, I mean, even without us talking about this beforehand, that's a great question because I started a podcast during the pandemic and like everything that good professionally that happened in my life was because of that podcast.
Yeah.
All of my personal network I was able to build, so many people that I was able to interview and then meet in person, would never happen if it wasn't for me just saying, it's the pandemic. Everyone wants to talk to strangers. Let's start a podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a huge event, obviously, for
Yeah.
other reasons.
It's so great that you mentioned that because for me personally, I had a jazz radio show. I wasn't doing as much as the famous interviews. I was really kind of in the music world and I was got to that crossroads like what am I going to do? There was just all of these circumstances in my life where it was like I have to fill the time and do it well. And I really reached out to a lot more musicians, a lot of musicians that would
Mm.
typically be traveling, and the stories and the things that were happening, talking to people in Spain with pots and pans that are getting clanked for the medical workers, those things that would put hackles up on your neck, like those human stories lifted all of us. We all felt connected. There was a synergy with humanity that wanted to be a part of it and swim through it that really did save our mental health.
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, that's one angle. I spent the pandemic in Sweden, and it wasn't really as much of a pandemic in Sweden as it was everywhere else. There were
Yeah,
no restrictive measures. I mean, it was in the news at the time,
absolutely.
but I lived for the several years before. My family, we lived in a small place in Sweden where networking was really very limited, professional networking especially. So, once the pandemic started happening, and I remember telling this to my colleagues. I worked for a Norwegian agency remotely, and I told them, now you get what it's like to be all alone. Like you're in an office, and now everyone wants to chat on Slack. Everyone's friendly, and have all the time in the world. So the pandemic kind of opened that up, the networking opportunity for people who are remote workers, working somewhere else, not going to the office. It completely leveled that playing field. It was a horrible event, obviously, like
Yeah.
for more than one reason. But the world obviously changed then, and I don't think we're going back.
No, we definitely are not going back. I kind of envied what was going on in Sweden and over there. I just really felt like, Fauci here in America said everybody's going to get this, and my day job, I work in a school district, so we're almost
Mm.
like plumbers. We're around germs all the time, and there's a
Fair
level,
point.
right? So there's a level of natural immunity that you build up. And if we all get into this antiseptic mode of not mingling and letting these biology take its course, it's going to rear up and be a different kind of beast.
Probably. I mean, I'm not even going to try to speak like a medical person because
Right.
I'm not,
Yeah.
obviously, but probably some sense in what you just said there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a gut feeling. So
Yep.
let me ask you this. I want to get to the heart and soul of what you do for your profession on a daily basis.
Right.
There's one thing on paper, but there's another thing in reality. So I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of grade school kids. It's career day. They're fifth, sixth graders, and the kid in the back of the room that's curious is like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" What's
Oh
your
man,
answer?
I mean, the thing is, my daughter's 10. I struggle to explain it to her. Thank you for putting me on the spot now
Oh,
in front of your huge audience. What I do is currently I build digital products, and I've been doing that for the last year or so. So I have a company with my co-founder. We find a need, like there's an industry like podcasting, for example. We find a product that's going to make podcasters' lives easier, and we decide to build it. That's just an example. We have other tools as well. So that's what I do historically. I was a web developer for 10 plus years. I did conversion optimization for 5 years. And now I realize, hey, let me try to actually build something that's not just fixing someone else's websites.
so of everything you do, and I'm coming from a podcaster standpoint here,
Mhm.
what do you enjoy the best? Is podcasting high on your list?
Very high. It's a zero revenue game for me. Like I've never made any direct revenue from podcasting. Client work, inbound, thanks to the podcast, sure, but it is about as high as it gets. I had a rule for the longest time. I was recording my episodes, my interview episodes on Fridays because I wanted to end the week on a high because that was always the best part of, you know what I'm talking about. You
Oh
meet a new
yeah.
person, you have a fun conversation. So Podcasting is extremely, extremely high. And I was just talking to another podcaster earlier this week, to people sitting on the fence, like, should I have a podcast? Not everyone should. I'm not going to say that. But if you're on the fence, that means you should. That means you absolutely
Uh-huh.
already know that you should. There's just something holding you back, because the opportunities that will arise from you having a podcast, whether that's a solo show or an interview show, are something that before you start, you cannot even imagine.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, podcasting high, very
Yeah.
high on the list, of
Yeah.
course.
Amen. So the weird thing about this, a quick story for you. I had a guy that called me up at one point, and it was one of these venture capital guys. He was like, "I
Hmm.
got all this money that we can loan you for your business." I was like, "Wait, wait, wait, wait. I'm a podcaster." It's like you said,
Yeah.
there's not all these revenue streams happening. So we start talking, and he was like, "Oh, wow, you do podcasting?" And he starts saying, "I've always wanted to do one." I was like, what's holding you back?" "Oh, well, I need to build a studio and do this, that, and the other." I was like, "No, no, 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 no. Do you got a computer? Yeah. Do you have access to a microphone or Amazon? Yeah. Then go." Okay? Because
Yeah.
at that point, once you start, then you can start building this thing around you. But if you do this whole thing where everything, like having a child or buying a house or changing careers, when you are waiting for the stars to align, they aren't. You have to just do it, you know?
Yeah,
So,
of course. And you can plan the first few steps,
yeah,
but don't plan the first 20 or 30 steps, because
exactly.
you have no idea what the steps 10 to 20 are going to be, or direction or anything. You just go for it, try it, and see where it takes you. That is my advice to everyone thinking about it.
I think it's modern therapy. And like you said, you don't know until you do it. It really
Yeah.
is. And it's still kind of weird to me because I started doing interviews in 2011 in earnest
Hmm.
for my jazz show
Wow.
and kind of on the side otherwise for famous interviews. And then when the pandemic happened, I started seeing it in TV shows and movies. I'm like, this podcasting thing is becoming hip. This is becoming
Yeah.
like a trend. Who would have known? And then, and then here we are. And
I mean,
it's,
there are Netflix shows with the leads being podcasters, and Netflix movies, and it's as mainstream as it gets
yeah,
from my perspective, at least. And it's not going to go away. It's just going to keep exploding, growing, not exploding. So yeah, I mean, for me, when I started my podcast is about digital optimization, which is where I work, what I
yeah,
do. I had a challenge of, let's try to get all those people whose courses I was taking, who I was learning from, let's try to get them on the podcast and try to meet them and talk to them, because, like, the hypothesis was they're at home, they
yeah,
cannot get out,
yeah.
they want to talk to someone new. Everyone said yes. I think that can still happen outside of the pandemic. Don't get me wrong. This is
Sure.
not a pandemic thing, because people, if you show interest, if you're genuinely kind and nice to them, who's going to say no? Like, the worst thing that
Right.
can happen is an unread message.
That's it. Yeah, you're totally, totally right. So take me back to what did you want to be when you were a kid? What was your dream
Oh,
life?
so honestly, I don't know. Like, I,
Yeah.
I really don't. But I'll tell you how it shows which university to go to, what to study. Basically, I had a list and I was crossing them out until I figured out there's only one left. So I guess I never knew it, and this is the industry. I mean, conversion optimization. It's really a lot of outfits, misfits from other industries, who just, this guy was a developer, this person was this person, and then they all fall into this and kind of find themselves among their peers. So I never had that thing that this is what I want to be when I grow up. Or I don't remember it, at least,
Yeah.
but I knew what I didn't want to do. Like, and every decision that I was making for a very long time was, how does this avoid me, get me out of the situation I don't want to be in, basically.
Yeah. So what were some foundational seeds planted in you early on in your life
Mm.
that made you want to be an entrepreneur and a podcaster?
Right. I mean, the podcast, I don't even know. My first job, this is a funny story. My first job, I was 18 or 19, just turned 19, I think. First year of university, I walked into a local TV station. I said, "You should give me a job. I should be your NBA basketball broadcaster." Like, literally, like, just like that. It was one morning. I just walked in, and I walked out with a job.
Wow.
So yeah, because they didn't have anyone for that. I mean, that's why I walked in there. So that was I guess the seed for this, for podcasting and for talking to people and for talking into a mic, was planted back then.
Yeah.
And then it took me so long to start a podcast. I think I bought my mic in 2014, not this one, another one. I bought a mic in 2014, tried to record one episode, just didn't really feel great. And then I held it in the back of my mind until 2021, when I started my podcast for real. So yeah,
Interesting. You know, for me, it was getting into podcasting helped me swim through that inner pool of mine.
Mm,
I was 4'11" in high school. I was the youngest of three. I always felt
right.
like no one listened. I didn't know where I was, no compass needle. So it was almost my way of saying, "Hey, what's up? What do we got?"
No,
Those
that makes
things.
sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
So,
I mean, podcasting, it's a completely fair game. Of course, there's this like superstar podcast where someone is a celebrity. They start. I mean, let's just say Meghan and Harry. They tried to have a podcast. It didn't really work
yeah.
because when there's no passion, it's not going to work. But unless you have a huge budget or you're a celebrity starting a podcast, it's a fair game. Like
Yeah.
anyone can have a successful podcast, and the definition of success can be different for different people, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, it really truly is a democracy because if it's good, people are going to come to it and
Yep.
it's going to get recognized. And there's nothing better than that. I mean, because sometimes you think, how did that show get on TV?
Oh
Because we
yeah.
grew up with a certain amount of channels and a certain amount of bandwidth that we were going to get fed information. But now it's like, it's the Wild West. It's like running out and staking your claim. This is what I got. If you want to listen, you do. If you don't, you don't.
That's really well said. Yeah, I mean, when you had, in my country, we had two TV channels when I was a kid,
Yeah.
and every show, like you had to know someone to like. You couldn't just create a show and put it online, on
Yeah.
air, not even online.
Yeah.
Now, like you said earlier, do you have a mic? You have a mic.
Yeah.
Start a podcast. Like
That's it.
that's how simple it is. Yep.
What was the first podcast that you got hooked on that gave you kind of
Ooh.
this idea?
So I'm a big fan of Bill Simmons and the Ringer Network. I was reading his articles when he was writing for ESPN like 20 years ago, I think, page two articles, and I was a big fan. So I mean, he's one of the first podcasters, like big podcasters. He's been doing it for 16, 17 years. So everything he does, absolutely, I'm a big fan. Also, Bill Burr, who's also
Oh, yeah.
one of the first
The Monday
podcasters,
morning.
and now there's a Thursday afternoon, Monday morning podcast. Like there's another, or maybe he doesn't have that format anymore. But that guy, because I'm a huge stand-up comedy fan, obviously, as soon as you find about Bill Burr, this guy's celebrity, you find he has a podcast. What's a podcast? Let me check it out. And
That's
then you
it.
just spend 2 hours listening to him ramble, and then you watch it special, and you realize, oh, he was just working out the material and just spinning his wheels and trying to see what works and what doesn't for his special. So yeah, Bill Burr and Bill Simmons are the first two without a doubt for me.
Yeah, Bill, I was listening to Bill years and years ago, and it was before it was like podcasting. It was like, I love
Like he was
Bill.
just rambling. He was
Yeah,
just rambling.
just going for it. The first one, when I really did research,
Yeah.
have you ever heard the podcast called Here Be Monsters?
No,
It's
no.
kind of an esoteric, interesting deep dive into things. It's almost like taking a Billy Collins poem and just honing in on it, like something
Mm,
you just haven't thought about, but
right.
it's
Okay.
well orchestrated.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. I mean, now there's so many podcasts that
Yeah,
you can't even list them all.
unreal.
There's genres of podcasts that did not exist 10 years ago. It was just
No,
podcasts.
yeah.
So shows you how much the industry has grown.
It used to be walking into an airport and having a bank of TVs, and you're like, which one do I pick? And now it's like walking into a library, and the Dewey Decimal System is just totally on
Right.
caffeine, exploding.
That's a really good one. Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
So, who's been a hero for you? Who's been an inspirational force for all this work you've done?
A hero. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know what a hero is, to be honest. Like it's hard to define a hero. Maybe role models or something like that. I don't know if I have a hero, if I'm
Yeah,
honest with you, but my grandfather was definitely a role model for me in my early life. There were some times in my life, like 10 years ago, when reading David Goggins in his book, and then the second book a few years ago definitely helped. And that way of thinking that you can figure it out on your own if you just commit to it.
yeah.
So I guess I don't know. Stoicism in general, like Stoic philosophy in general, is something that I will never disagree with.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. So let me ask you this. If you could have a dream human that's alive on the planet right now to be a guest, whether it's in your field or anywhere else, and you
That's
could sit
awesome.
down and talk to him, who is it?
I have an answer because I posted about this on LinkedIn. Maybe it's not the dream, the best, like biggest, but I would love to talk to Tim Ferriss because he kind of started so many things that are happening now. Like, I mean, the remote work revolution, the figure out own your time, all that stuff. That's a norm
Yeah.
almost now for most people. 17, 18 years ago when we started it, he was like the crazy person talking about it.
Huh?
Also, he's huge. Like his podcast is huge. I would like to ask him about that.
Yeah. So, as you know, it's the life of a podcaster. I don't think people understand how much goes into it and how many things, many moving parts. And then you're an entrepreneur and you got a business. And then you have a
Hmm.
life and a family and your soul. How do you balance? What gets you up every day to do this work?
Ah, uh, I mean, it's really. I try to optimize my time and my workflows as much as possible. I mean, I've launched two products recently that are big projects. I have the podcast. I do some client work on the side. It's a lot of work, but if you have good workflows, if you just optimize everything you do, so you don't waste time, never optimize the creative stuff. Always let the human do the creative stuff. But there's so much boring stuff in our lives that we can automate, especially with AI now, that I think it's possible to have almost like two or three jobs, careers at the same time with
Yeah.
all the automation we can do right now.
So let's say you walk into a room and there's all the people, the clients, and everybody you've ever worked with that knows you from a business sense. And you swim through that sea of people and go up to a podium and you get to tell them one fun thing about you, one fun story. What is it?
Uh, First of all, I love the questions. Like the questions are so good. One fun story. One fun story. I would not be a web developer if I wasn't a lifeguard before that. And I'm not going to explain that, but
Right.
that's a fun enough story.
Yeah, that's awesome. What's the biggest risk that you've ever taken?
The biggest risk, not acting on some things that I thought I should have acted on. Like always, the biggest risk is not doing the thing that you believe should be done,
Yeah.
and holding, delaying some things in life. I would say in my career as well. So if you have a gut feeling that's there for not for 15 minutes, but if it's there for weeks or months, that something should be done, you have to do it.
Yeah.
So the biggest risk is not doing something. And I'm not going to give you examples, but it's always like the biggest mistakes are always not following that feeling that something needs to be done.
It always comes down to that quote for me from Mark Twain. When he got to the end of his life, he said, I don't regret what I've done. I regret what I didn't do. You
Yep.
know?
Always. It's always that. And I mean, and those regrets are much bigger and much stronger than the ones after you do something. If your heart is in the right place,
Yeah.
unless you're a super evil human being and just trying to hurt people, of course, assuming you're not that, whoever's listening to this, the regret is always going to be significantly greater for the things you haven't done.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. If you had a dream tonight and ran into the 18-year-old version of you, you could give that young version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've led, the wisdom you've gained. What advice would you dispense?
Well, it's not gonna be buy Bitcoin because that's too obvious. Like, but the advice is as soon as you think you should do something, just go ahead and do it. Because
Yeah.
if I had started a podcast in 2014 instead of 2021, now would be my 11-year anniversary, and who knows how big that podcast could have been.
Yeah.
If I had decided to go into web development instead of dragging my ass through architecture studies, who knows what I could have done if I started web development in the web 2.0, like all that bubble.
Yeah.
So who knows? There's just, better be early than late, I guess,
Yeah.
is really good advice for someone who's 18.
So of everything that you've done and evolved into and accomplished, what are you the proudest of?
The proudest of, I mean, I'm an extremely loyal person. I would say this is something that I take a lot of pride in, and people, I'd rather have several meaningful connections than thousands of kind of connections. So I think loyalty is number one. Also, I don't know, when I want to get something done, I usually get it done.
Yeah.
It's kind of it feels silly to talk about myself and praise myself,
Right.
honestly.
Yeah.
But yeah, those two, I guess.
So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends,
Hmm.
listeners, clients, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Who I am, I'm just a person figuring out life. Like that's just I'm not going to pretend that I have it figured out. I mean, there's decades ahead of me, hopefully. I don't, I'm living this age for the first time. I'm a parent I don't know how this works. I'm just figuring it out as I go.
Well said. So if anyone wants to tune into the podcast, hire you, learn more questions, where do they go?
The best place to go is nohackspod.com. So nohacks podcast. Go there and you can get in touch with me there. Find me on LinkedIn. Use my first name, last name. That's the best way.
What an absolute joy. Thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to meet you. Best of luck. Keep putting the good
Thank
energy
you.
out there. It shines, man.
Pleasure to talk to you, Joe. Thank you.
Hello, friends. Joe Dimino here. I just wanted to let you know that after 30 years or so, I have finally released my first book of poetry through the mighty Spartan Press here in Kansas City, Missouri. As the creator and host of both Neon Jazz Radio and the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino podcast, along with being a visual artist, I'm ready to embark on a new adventure and want you to be a part of it. You can get a copy online via Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and actually on the streets in Kansas City at the great Prospero's bookstore off 39th Street. You can also visit joedimino.com for links to the book, to more poetry, and everything in my world, including paintings. Thanks for all of the love and support over the years, and please dig the words.